All right, it's good to be here today. It's good to put husbands with wives. I met a lot of the wives didn't know what the husbands look like, and your typical Baptist spread out everywhere. All right, so, and the back seats are already taken. Anybody in the back row over there? There's some in the back row over there. All right, so let's turn our Bibles to the book of Acts. The book of Acts. Been privileged to come to this, and as I told my church, I'm glad that my wife's a good preacher, because I got to come out here also because she got to speak to the ladies, but we've had a great time. I just want to talk to you a simple message today. What does your name mean? You ever thought about what your name means? It's funny when you talk to people that are from Hawaii and you ask them, the first name doesn't usually mean anything, but the second name usually does. If I were to ask you, if people in your community were to say, what does your name mean? What would they say? What would your family say? What would your church say? And last but not least, the most important, what would God say? You know, everybody has a name in here, right? All right, how many of you have interesting names? Raise your hand if you have an interesting name. Anybody have an interesting name? All right, so let's go interesting names. What's your name that's interesting? What is your name?
Miguel.
All right. I have no idea what he said. Okay. Miguel? Miguel. Okay, I actually like that. You raised your hand up. What's your name? Fred. Now you're the chef, aren't you? All right, you're the what? You're the chef. How many of you were named after somebody? Okay, my wife was named after, and I'm going to date her with this. She was named after the show Gidget. How many of you ever saw the show Gidget? All right, there was a lady by the name of Ann in that. I was named after a neighbor that my dad had. And I was talking to him. I've shared this with some of the ladies. When I was talking to him, I said, well, what was this neighbor like? And I was talking to my mom about it. She's since passed away, but she said, I don't really know. Your dad really didn't like him. So I'm named after a neighbor that he didn't even like. Okay? My mom and dad did not get along when it came to naming our names. My dad named me, and my mom didn't like it, so she called me by a nickname. My full name is Walter Wayne Wagner, but I went by the name of Wally. Now, we're in a different generation where people don't know this, but how many of you saw Leave It to Beaver? Okay, I've heard every Leave It to Beaver joke. Every time I would have a friend that would be Beaver, which was my friend's nickname growing up. And my sister was named Teresa Kay. My dad didn't like it, and he changed her name. And he wasn't even a religious person, but he said, I don't want that. That sounds too Catholic. And so he named her TK. If you were to take my name and you wrote my name down about 10 years ago, I wrote it out, and it says Walter Wayne Wagner. Of course, you hear the www all the time. It's like, okay, is the World Wide Web. But if you were to take the second letter, watch this. I bet no one can do this in their name. You take my second letter of every one of my names, it's an A. If you take the fifth letter, every one of them's an E. And if it has a sixth letter, it's an R. So when you look at it, you go, why would they do that? And I remember one time when my daughters were born, my wife got to, how many men in here got to name your children? Anybody get to name their children? Okay, bless your heart. I never got to name our children. My wife named our children, and the first one was Megan Brooke. And as I told the ladies this, we did not know this, but she's our babbler, our babbling Brooke. She talks all the time. And then I have another one, Meredith Joy, and she's the happy one. Just their names just happen to fit. And so when the second one was born, she said, well, let's name her Meredith Joy. And I was like, what? Because to me, growing up, I have an Uncle Meredith. So I would never name a child, to me it was a guy's name. And so then I told her, I said, okay, you can name her, but can I spell it? And now I look back and I wish I wouldn't have done what I did, and I changed the spelling of her name, and it's Meredyth. She goes to West Coast, and whenever I'd call West Coast, I'd always say, it's Meredith, and it's spelled with a Y. And they'd say, okay, there it is, because there were about 3 or 4 Merediths at the time. But you know what? Your name means something to somebody, right? It means something to your preacher. If I were to ask your preacher, who is so-and-so? He would give me a description of who you are. Hopefully it'd be a good description, amen? All right, but then there's some people when you meet them, their name stands out because you know who they are. And I was studying this and I was looking this up, and as you go, I want you to turn to the book of Acts. We're going to read a story in the book of Acts, and we're going to read a story about a name in the book of Acts. I want you to go to Acts chapter 5. Everybody's familiar with this. Acts chapter 5, and there's a man by the name of Ananias in Acts chapter 5. Does anybody know what the name, without Google searching it or anything, does anybody know what the word Ananias means? Now, everybody knows the story of Ananias, and who's he paired up with? Sapphira, okay? If you were to label him, there's some words I would think of, but it's not the word what his name actually means. His name actually means favor of the Lord. Ananias. Now, Sapphira, we get sapphire and some of these other things for that. Her name means beautiful. So there's this name, and I think it's interesting. Every time I talk to him, he's got these words, these Hawaiian words. My wife and I are still trying to figure out these Hawaiian words, okay? She feels like she's an expert at it. She can pronounce every road sign, and you know what? I don't know if she's right or not. I know that my GPS is terrible. You know, that like highway, I get that all the time. Turn on like highway. And I have to say it. Leaky. I like that. I like speaking like this. I'm going to speak Hawaiian when I go back to Tennessee. So, but, you know, she's saying all these words, and I'm like, I have no idea what these roads mean, and there's a lot of different roads. How many of you are new to the island? How many have just got here? Within a year. All right? And you're trying to get used to everything, trying to go. And so when I looked at this, I was studying this out, and I saw this man and this woman that we know the story. But can I just step outside the box a little bit? Do you not think, husbands and wives, that you need to work together? I gave a lesson for the teens, and I said the number one thing that you need to do is be consistent. Is it a good thing to work together? Yes. You know, when you're raising those children, how many of you, when you were children, knew which parent would let you do more? Did you ever go to the one that would let you do more and they didn't answer the way you thought they would? And then you go to the one that would say, no, I'm a mama's boy. I'm the youngest of four. And I was proud to be a mama's boy. So I would go to mom every time. When I needed new clothes, when I wanted to go someplace, I'd ask mom. But there was times when mom would do this. How many of you remember this? Go ask your father. And then you'd go ask your father. How many of you played that tennis match between the two of them? Go ask your mother, go ask your father, go ask your mother, go ask your father. And I think they were just wearing me down so that I would forget what the question was. And so here you have all these things going on in your life, but you know what? You need to work together. How many of you believe that you should be in church when the doors are open? I'm not going to look up here, but you know what? You need to be in church when the doors are open. And let me ask you this last question. As a pastor, I love watching this. I don't know if you do this, but I love watching when they pass the offering plates around. Because I breed dogs, and dogs know when they do wrong. You know what they do? They don't show eye contact to you. I can go down, if one of them's messed up in our barn, I can go and I can tell you which dog did it by the one that's not looking at me. And people do the same thing when the offering plate goes down. They don't want to make eye contact with that usher because you know what that means? I've got to give. But I want to point out some very obvious things with this that maybe you've not even thought about. Let's go ahead and let's read the story in Acts chapter 5, and we're going to read all the way down to verse number 11. It says this, but a certain man named Ananias with Sapphira his wife sold a possession and kept back part of the price, his wife also being privy to it, and brought a certain part and laid it at the apostles' feet. And Peter said, Ananias, why hath Satan filled thine heart to lie to the Holy Ghost and to keep back part of the price of the land? While it remained, was it not thine own? And after it was sold, was it not thine own power? Why hast thou conceived this thing in thine heart? Thou hast not lied unto me, but unto God. Ananias, hearing these words, fell down and gave up the ghost, and great fear came on all them that heard these things. Can you imagine what the church did after this happened? First of all, God gave Peter the insight to know that he wasn't doing what was right. And then all of a sudden he asks these questions to him. And I think he was giving him a second chance, but the guy was going to hold to this. They had this plan in action and it took off. And so then it goes on, it says, and the young man rose, wound him up and carried him out and buried him. And it was about the space of 3 hours after, when his wife, not knowing what was done, came in. And Peter answered unto her, tell me whether ye sold this land for so much. And she said, yea, for so much. Then Peter said unto her, how is it that ye have agreed together to tempt the Spirit of the Lord? Behold, the feet of them which have buried thy husbands are at the door, and shall carry thee out. Then fell she down straightway at his feet, and yielded up the ghost. And the young men came in and found her dead, and carrying her forth, buried her by her husband. Now watch this next verse. It says this, it says, and great fear came upon all the church, and upon as many as heard these things. You know, when you study this out, it's a devastating story. But there's some obvious things here that I've already stated, that they were actually doing some good work. Right? You've got to study this out and find out what's going on in Acts chapter 1 through 4 and why they're doing this. They're trying to take care of the people in the church. But yet they had this land, and it wasn't everything that they had, but they had this piece of property and they sold it. And they knew what they were going to sell it for, but they sold it for what they wanted to or whatever, and they took some back. And they, as the question was asked, you're not lying to me, Peter, you're lying to God. And you're working this together. See, the parents, they were working together. But you know what? They were working together the wrong way. If you have teenagers in here, I love being with teenagers, and I've enjoyed your teenagers here. But you know what? They know how to pit you against each other. You better understand you have a plan and follow that plan and do it what's right. And ask God to give you that plan, not you to figure out that plan. See, they had their own beliefs, and they were doing it their own way. And they lost their life. I've said this from our church. I wonder what the offerings were the next week. Guarantee you they were up. Because God sees everything. And the other thing, you know, here they're working together, but here they're in church. There's a verse that talks about in the midst of the congregation, that can be in sin in the midst of the congregation. Why do you come to church? To get your heart right. Why do you read your Bible? To get your heart right. But here, these people, they were in church. Now, watch this. There were some people that did not die that never came to church in this story. Think about that. These people came to church and they lost their life because they didn't do what was right. Too much is given, what? Much is required. And so they're in the midst of the congregation and they bring it. And, you know, this story would never have happened in this day. You know why? Because 3 hours later, Sapphira didn't even know about it. Now think about if that happened in this church today. In 10 seconds, everybody in the world would know what was going on. Right? How many of you ever heard this thing? It's called Facebook. The internet. YouTube. I mean, everything would be coming out and everybody would know everything about this. See, these people, they were working together. They were in church. And the third one that really gets me is they were givers. They were givers. They gave money. It wasn't like they didn't do anything. They were somewhat concerned about the church. But the problem was, there's a verse. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 16. This is a story in the Old Testament, of course, when they're trying to figure out who's going to be the next king. And here comes the guy that really sets it all off. They tell Jesse, Samuel tells Jesse, bring these guys in front of me, let me look at them. And the first one they bring out is the brother called Eliab. And in verse number 6 it says this, in 1 Samuel chapter 16, it says, and it came to pass when they were come, that he looked on Eliab and said, surely the Lord anointed is before him. Now, this is a very interesting story. Because in biblical times, what was going on? The oldest son got all of this. And he was probably, being the oldest, and we know he was a warrior because he was there when Goliath was on the scene. He's the one that says, a few sheep, if you were in my class. He's the one that runs down David at that point. So he was probably a very big man. And so he says, here's the guy. This is the one that's going to be chosen. Now watch the reaction that Samuel says. It says, but the Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him, for the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. You know, here we have the epitome of what God's looking at. He could care less about our outward appearance. You know, this morning, the people that we're staying with, they came and they brought coffee. How many of you like to look presentable when someone sees you in the morning? I was not presentable this morning. I don't really, when I go to sleep, you probably have the same problem. My hair all goes to a point, amen? And so, you do that? You have to pull it all down. I understand that. Or shave it all off, whatever you want to do. But my hair was at a point, I almost looked like some form of a dinosaur with that shield on my head. And she goes, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you up. I said, you didn't wake me up. I'm just not prepared for the day. You know, we don't like to be seen that way, but you know what? God could care less about your outward appearance. He's looking at your inside. He's looking about who you are. You know what sometimes I have a problem with? Forgiving people. You know, as a pastor, sometimes people can say really mean things. And they never say it to you. It's a third party that comes and says something back to you. Did you hear what they said? Did you hear what they said? And then what really makes me mad is when my girls were younger and they would say things to my girls about me. And it would be some person that might be upset. When you have a Christian school, you can make people upset so fast. You give them demerits. You give them all these things that they have to do. You give them the inevitable word that teenagers hate. It's called homework. They don't like that. And so they'll say things about you. How do you respond to it? You know what? This is not what, God's not concerned about your outward appearance. David was a very young man at this time. But David eventually would be a very brawly man. He would be a man of men. He was a captain. He was a guy that would take over when he went in. But God looked on the inward. You have Ananias and Sapphira. They were in church. They were working together. And they were giving in their church. But they were doing it all the wrong ways. Can't we do that? I've heard the story of the man that has his kids in the back seat and they're driving to church and he just wants to beat the living stew out of them because they're not listening. And then when they pull in the parking lot, everybody changes when they pull in the church parking lot. They put on their church face. You know, we got to go in and we got to hear about the love of Jesus. And he just wanted to beat the love of Jesus out of all these people. I mean, we look at it and we go, oh my word, because we act different sometimes in front of people. But God looks at our heart. Here's Ananias. His name means this, favor of the Lord. When you look in Acts chapter 5, do you think he was favorable to the Lord? No, he wasn't. So that name Ananias, have you ever noticed that there's certain names that we do not name our children from the Bible? Anybody have a girl named J.U. in here? How about Delilah? Some of these names are words we would never, there's my favorite name in the Old Testament is called Bigtha. B-I-G-T-H-A. If you have a big child, name him that. But you know, we don't want these names. How many of you have a common name? Raise your hand if you have a common name. All right. How many of you have not such a common name? You know what? Your name means something to somebody. When your preacher thinks of you, and he doesn't talk about you, I can tell you that. He talks good. I've never heard anything negative. But when he thinks of you and he thinks about this church, what does your name mean to him? Are you an encourager? Are you someone that's always here? And I'm trying to encourage you to be here. When I first got into ministry, I didn't know how people, they don't train you in college how people will respond, how people will say things. We had a family in our first church. You know what their goal in life was? to make the pastor feel bad before he preached. They would always say things to him. They would say things about him. They would give him bad news before he preached. And so me and the other assistant pastor figured it out. And so what we were doing is we were running the distraction. We would see them come in the church, and one week it would be him, the next, and we couldn't do it every other week. We'd do different patterns. It's like, okay, I got them for 2 weeks, then you got them for 1 week, and I'll do it for 2 weeks, and you do it for 3 weeks. And when they would come in, our whole goal, Pastor, was to keep them away from away from him before he walked up in the pulpit. And we would start talking to him, ask them dumb questions. Because you get where you run out of questions. And so I'm asking them questions. And when I saw the preacher step on the platform, the first step, everything was okay. But that was their goal. What was interesting is that man became a pastor. I wonder how his men treated him. Because you know what? You reap what you sow. So here you have Ananias and Sapphira. They're doing something good. They're selling property. They're giving it to the church. They were in church. But they both passed away because they didn't lie to man. They lied to God. And Ananias' name means what? Favor of the Lord. Okay. Have you ever noticed that there's another Ananias in Acts chapter? In one of the chapters of Acts? We kind of overlook him. But I want you to turn to him and let's see what his name means. Acts chapter 9 comes on the scene. Acts chapter 9. Now this Ananias has the same name, and it's not the same Ananias. He's not been reborn or resurrected. It's a different one. And here's the story in Acts chapter 9. If you know the story of Acts chapter 9, the story that Saul is walking down a road and he gets blinded. Remember that? And I think it's interesting that God uses another Ananias to help him out. Now watch this. I'm going to give you 5 points, and I just want you to listen to me on this because Acts chapter 9 has a lot of interesting things in it. He comes in on the scene in verses 1 through 9 is a story of Saul. And then all of a sudden in Acts chapter 9, here is another Ananias. Verse number 10 says this, and there was a certain disciple at Damascus named, what's his name? Spelled the same way. What's it mean? Ananias it means favor of the Lord. And it says, and to him said to the Lord in a vision, Ananias, and he said, behold, and watch this, he wakes up and says, here I am, Lord. You know what? That's a great aspect of a man. It says that he was what? What was his job? It says he was a disciple. And so here he's saying, okay, here I am. What do you want me to do? How do you like it when God tells you what to do? It's always wonderful to know that, except if you're Noah. All right? How many of you would like to have Noah's job with what he did? I mean, can you imagine God telling you to build an ark? How many of you are good with your hands? You could build things, okay? How many of you ever built an ark without power tools? You think about that. And the other thing with Noah is he stood out in front of all of his neighbors because he has this big boat in his backyard. He's getting all the wood he possibly can do, and it takes him over 100 years to build it. And so his name, when God tells you, here I am, you better watch it. As I was telling some people, I want my kids to be with me, but that's not how God always works. I've got a daughter that's about 3 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours away from me. I've got another daughter that's getting married and moving to California. Now, I don't know if you know anything off this island, but Tennessee and California, a long way away from each other. And so I won't be able to see the grandkids as much. My wife will probably get as many miles as she can on that airplane to see the grandkids when they eventually come. You know, I would want them to be with me, but that's not how God always works. I grew up in a small town of Farmersburg, Indiana. My wife grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. You know, we're not close to either one of those. My mother passed away about, I think, 13 or 14 years ago. My dad still lives there. I don't get to see him that much. I would like to see him more, but that's just not God's plan in my life. I would love for my daughter to work with me. I would love for my other daughter to live in my town, but that's not how God always works. Because when God speaks to you, he's going to tell you what to do. Have you ever been in a situation where God told you to do something, you didn't do it? How you felt? I was working at college, and I had worked for a guy, and we were having a banquet, and he had given me $60 cash. And back then in the 80s, that was a good chunk of change. And he also kept me on the clock, but he gave me $60. He said, "Thank you for working the banquet." I walked into the dormitory, and I made one mistake. I went into the dormitory, and there was a way to get to my room that was quicker, but you had to cut through a bathroom. And so I went through the bathroom, and there was a guy at the sink, and what had happened is he had tripped and fallen, and he had bit through his lip. And he was trying to get it to stop. See, I knew about the boy. The boy had a leg that was longer than the other, so he wore the special shoes, and he was known for falling. And I walked through, and I saw him, and God spoke to me and said, "You need to help him out." And so I asked him, I said, "Well, are you going to go get this fixed?" He said, "I could, but I don't have the money." I said, "Well, how much would it cost?" Guess what he said? $60. So I did the most spiritual thing I could possibly do. I looked at him and said, "Listen, I'll go to my room and I'll pray for you." So I went and I just left him there. I went into the room and I gotten back late, and my roommates were in there. And so God is just beating me up because I knew what I was supposed to do, but I didn't do it. And so all of a sudden, I'm talking to God out loud, and my roommates are not hearing what he's saying back to me. And so I'm sitting there going, "No, no, no." I worked all day. No. So finally, after about 5 minutes of God beating me up, I walked into that room where he was at, still trying to get this taken care of. I took the $60, and you want to talk about a terrible spirit? God taught me something wonderful that day, that I can do what's right in the wrong spirit, and it doesn't mean anything. I took that money, Brother Surface, and I just threw it at his chest and said, "Go get your lip fixed." I walked off. I tell you that story not because I'm proud of what I did. I did what God wanted me to do. But do you think I got a blessing for it? No. Because God told me and spoke to me and said, "Hey, go do that," but I didn't do it right. Since then, I think that story changed my life, because now when I see someone in need, that's what I want to do. I want to do it with the right spirit so I can be blessed for it. So when God speaks to you, how do you respond? Ananias said, "Here I am. Do whatever you want with me. Here I am." Now, it's totally different from the Ananias in chapter 5. He says, "Listen, I'll do whatever you want." And you know what? God, point number 2 is this: God trusted in him. I remember growing up, my mom and dad would volunteer me for certain things. I just loved that. You know, hey, go sit over there and take care of Miss Lane's animals. Go mow Mrs. Gobble's yard. And it was just all constantly, we were taking care of all the people around us. I just loved that. Because you know what? I had no life. Actually, I did. And it used to drive me crazy. See, I grew up, how many of you are 40 years and older? Raise your hand. Okay. I grew up before DVRs. Amen. Amen. And you know what my mom and dad would always do? They'd always ask me to do something at 7:25 or 7:55, right when it was a climactic part of the show I was watching, and I could never watch it again because they don't do what they do now. You had to wait 16 weeks to find out what was going on. And I remember them making me do all these things in my life, and sometimes they would volunteer me for something. Watch what God does to Ananias. Keep reading and go to verse number, let's go 10, we'll start in 10 again. It says, "And there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and to him said the Lord in a vision, 'Ananias,' he said, 'Behold, I am here, Lord.' And the Lord said unto him, 'Arise and go into the street which is called Straight, and inquire of the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus. For behold, he prayeth.'" Now watch verse number 12. "And hath seen in a vision a man named" what? Do you understand what just happened? He didn't give him a choice. He said, he told Saul that a man by the name of Ananias. Now, if I was Ananias at that point, I'd probably have a hot list of other Ananiases and say, "Okay, why don't you talk to him? Why don't you talk to him? Why don't you talk to him? You need to go talk to him." But the key thing was this, that he was a disciple. He knew what he needed to do. And so God trusted in him to say, "Here's a guy by the name of Ananias." So when he comes in later to Paul and he says his name's Ananias, that vision has been answered. God totally trusted in him. Does God trust in you? See, some of my best verses, my favorite verses in the Bible is Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. And everybody knows those verses. Let's say them together. It says, trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not into thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy path. When you read those two verses, there's three things I got to do and one thing God promises to do. Now, I can trust in him. As I told the church on Wednesday night, I don't like to fly, okay? You know, and I'm on this island, so I can tell you I flew, all right? I was praying that the pilots all had enough sleep and they weren't staying up playing video games or watching movies, that they were very alert. And then I told my wife, I said, I hope they can find those small islands in this massive amount of water. You know, I was praying for them. We got to trust in him. That's easy to do. You know what my hard part is? It's the second part. Every man in here, and most of the women in here would say, that's the hard part. Because see, we can trust in him. How many of you trust in things all the time? You actually do. When you drove here, didn't you trust other vehicles not to run into you? How many of you, when you sat down in your chair, trusted in that chair? I've told our church one day I'm going to take one pew, take all the bolts out of it, just randomly pick a pew and just see what happens. And you know what? The next time they come in, they won't be trusting in those pews as much as they trust in those pews now. I didn't see anybody. I saw a couple come in. They didn't sit down in a chair and say, okay, has anybody sat in this chair today? Because I just want to make sure it's okay. And test a little bit. I felt sorry for the little boy first hour, just you squishing him on the front row. But you know, we trust in things all the time. We can trust in the Lord. But the second part, lean not to thine own understanding. How many times do you try to figure things out? All the time. Okay, man, let's be honest with ourselves in here. Have you ever bought something and there's something in the boxes that you buy, it's called instructions? How many of you ever bought something and thought you could handle it yourself? You don't need the instructions. My wife bought me a, what was that thing called in the back? Oh yeah, she bought me a grill. And it was I couldn't remember what it was called, okay? It's having a moment. And a grill. See, I'm going to have if I don't know what it's called, I'm going to have a hard time putting it together. So I started putting it together. And you get to that part, and I was like, this won't fit. I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I went and got a hammer. I was going to make it fit. There's not very many pieces to a grill. So I started putting it together, and I was like, man, it's not shutting like it should. And I beat it a little, and it finally got in there. And I put it all together, and then I was like, okay, it worked. And I put it all together. I set it up against the wall, and I looked. And the part that wouldn't fit together, it was facing me, but on the front of it, in small letters, it said back. I had switched the bottom piece to it should have been the other direction. And I had just beat it to make it fit. And then we had to use that grill until it went bad. But every time it was just a content. When I'd look at it, I go, man, if I'd have just listened to what the rules were. But the Bible says this, trust the Lord with all thine heart and lean not to thine own understanding. We don't understand everything, but we try to figure it out. How many times has God ever did something in your life that you go, this is just not the normal way that it should have happened, but it happened. And God knew exactly what he was doing. The Israelites, they come up on the Red Sea. I would have never thought, part the Red Sea, walk over on dry land, and everything's going to be okay. But I'm not God, and neither are you. We can trust in him, but we've got to quit leaning into our own understanding. And then when you get through the whole thing, acknowledge him. Because when you acknowledge him, you're saying, listen, I didn't understand this, but I'm telling you, I trust in you, and it's an amazing thing. And guess what he'll do? He'll direct your path. You know, we don't necessarily understand everything, but we have a God that does. And if the God can create this whole planet that we're on, And you talk about massively different. My wife and I are just, I know some of you have been here many, many years, and you look around and you see the islands, and you see the land, you see the foliage, you see the mountains, and you get used to it. We are just enamored by looking at it. And you just see how great God is when you look at it. I've been to the Smokies. We live in the Smoky Mountains. I've been in the Rocky Mountains, and they're just beautiful. But your mountains here are just, it's like a combination of both of them, and it's just amazing. Now, we've not seen much sunshine, but we've seen a lot of different things in this, and we look and we go, wow, we're just amazed at how God does this. I don't understand how God works all the time, but that's not my job. Ananias in this, he listened for God. The second thing, he trusted in him. But you know what I like about God? He gives us a reason in our life to look at things and figure out what's going on. Watch what Ananias says. Point number 3 is this. God's given the ability to reason. Look at verse number 13 and 14. Let's go back to verse number 12. It says, and he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hands on him that he might receive his sight. Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard by many of this man how much evil he hath done to thy saints at Jerusalem. And here he hath authority from the chief priest to bind all that call on his name. You got to remember one person's name. What one person's name is Ananias thinking about as he says this? He's remembering a man by the name of what? Stephen. Stephen has been killed, right? And who was in charge of it? Paul was in charge of it. And he knew that he had the ability to do this. And so he looks at it and he says, listen, I know what this man's capable of. There's not any problem with doubting what God tells you to do. But you still got to do it. See, sometimes we get in that doubting mode and we never do it. Right? Anybody guilty of that? I'm guilty of it. You get in the doubting mood and say, I can't do this, I can't do this. Missions giving. Our church, we run about 140 in our church. We support 100 missionaries at $100 a month. That's a lot of money for a small church to do. I don't know how God does it, but he does it. And I go, I just don't understand this. But you know what? Individually, we each have to give. And they give, and they give, and they give, and they give, and we have enough money to pay the missionaries for a couple months in storage. But I can't comprehend it. It doesn't make any sense. We don't have any wealthy people. We just have people that give. And I looked at it and I thought, wow, how does God do this? I don't know how God does everything. I just know that he can. How many times does he use things? I mean, you think about it. In the Bible, what did he use? He used a burning bush. Would you ever use a burning bush to talk to somebody? How about a donkey? Would you ever use a donkey to talk to somebody? Yes, some people would. And he talks to donkeys. If you want to talk with him later, he'll tell you what your donkey's thinking. As I look at this, I think, man, we don't do the same thing God does. Aren't you thankful that you're not God? And I'm so thankful that I'm not God. I'm so thankful God doesn't think like me. And here he's given this voice of reason. He says, listen, this man can kill me if I go. And he's probably saying in his mind, and you told him I was coming. God, I don't know how this is going to work, but this is what I'm thinking. I am thinking that I'm in a situation that here's a man that could kill me, and I've still got this reason. But I want to say this. God had a plan for Saul. He had a wonderful plan for Saul. You know, when they asked Jesus who is the best Christian or best person, what does he say? John the Baptist. He talks about John the Baptist. Paul had not came on the scene. Paul wrote more books in the New Testament than anybody else did. And I want to tell you, he was probably one of the best Christians, and he was the one that stood toe-to-toe with a lot of people. They say he was short in stature, but he wasn't short in character. And I could see him standing and talking to all these people. God had a plan for Saul. Now watch what it says in verse number 15. And here Ananias is soaking all this in, and it says in verse number 14, and here he hath authority from chief priest to bind all that call on his name. And then it says in verse 15, but the Lord said unto him, go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles and the kings and the children of Israel. Now watch verse number 16. He could have stopped at verse 15, but he's also telling Ananias that this man's going to suffer. And it says in this, it says, For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake. Paul was one of the best Christians ever lived, but you know what he had? And I liked what you said today. We're never promised that everything's going to be great in a Christian walk. In fact, all the calamities that these people went through in the Bible, they were made known who they were by what they went through. For instance, watch this. Jonah and realize he's named over 3 days of his life. His whole life, 3 days, that's what we remember him about. How would you like to be labeled for 3 days of your life? Rahab yet God used her. But you know what? The last point is the one I really want to hone into you. Number one, you need to listen for God. Number two, you need to trust in him. Number three, God's going to give you a reason, the ability to reason things. Number four, God has a plan for Saul. But can I tell you this? Not only does God have a plan for Saul, but he had a plan for Ananias. When God tells you to do something, get all in. I've had missionaries that are personal friends of mine, and I like asking them questions. And I'll say, well, how was your trip so far? And he said, well, I've heard people say, well, I went to one church and they wouldn't even talk to me. I was like, what? He said they won't even talk to me. They're afraid that if their kids come and talk to me, maybe God will call them in the mission field. And I've heard more than one missionary say that. That was just absurd to me. Well, they won't even sit down and eat with me because they're afraid they'll get the missionary flu or something. They're afraid that God's going to call them to Africa and all these other things. So when we get in, we got to be all in. Now watch this. I'm going to read this next one. You're going to see where Paul comes on this. Ananias's plan for Ananias is found. Go to verse number, and I love this verse. Let's start again in verse number 13. It says, and Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard by many of this man how much evil he hath done to the saints of Jerusalem. And here he hath authority from the chief priest to bind all that call on his name. If you were to ask Ananias at this point what he thought of Saul, what would you think the answer would be? Man, I don't want to go see him. I'm going to do this, but I'm going to be scared to death when I go. Then God tells him, he says, but the Lord said unto him, go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel to me to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how great things he must suffer for thy name's sake. Now I'm going to read, and I want you to, when I stop reading, I want you to read the next word. Want me to show you how I knew Ananias was all in? Remember, 2 verses before this, he's scared to death of what's going to happen. But watch this. In verse number 17, it says, for Ananias went his way and entered into his house, and putting his hands on him, said, what's the next word? Brother. He flipped after God told him what to do, even though he had that reason of understanding that there could be some bad things. He flips from this Saul that could kill him to calling him as he goes in to lay his hands on him, brother. Now, I don't know about you, but when you call someone brother in this church, what does it mean? You're going the same direction. And he says, brother Saul, the Lord, even Jesus, that appeared unto thee in the way, as thou camest, hath sent me, that thou mightest receive thy sight and be filled with the Holy Ghost. Immediately there fell off from his eyes that had been scales, and he received sight forthwith, and arose and was baptized. Now I want to end it with this. If I were to ask you about these two guys, Ananias and Sapphira, their life ended just like that, right? Did they get any more rewards for what they had done? They were in church, but their life ended. Now watch this. The other Ananias was given a very hard task to do. He follows it out. He gets it done. At the end of this story, does his life end? No. But there's something that's very interesting in this, and I believe this is true. When you plant a seed or you do something and you witness to somebody and they accept Christ as they're your personal fruit. Can you understand the fruit that Ananias had off of just one man he was willing to go visit that could kill him? Can you imagine the fruit he got off of a man by the name of Saul that when he went in to lay his hands on, he called him brother? Do you understand how much fruit he got in the future because of what Saul did? But we call him Paul. What a difference in Ananias's. What a difference in names. They're the same, spelled the same way, but two different, distinct things that happen in their life. Can I ask you a question? What do people think of when they say your name?